This is part 8 of the Craftsman Emerson 150 drill press rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 7, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be polishing some parts. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. First parts we're going to be working on are these feed handle rods. There are 3 of them. They're pretty rusted, but they're not too badly pitted. The best part about this is that the outside circumference of these rods is not important. So we can sand them, grind them, whatever we need to do to get them down to a smooth bare metal. And for that, we're going to dry sand them. So here I'm starting with a 60 grit, and I'm going to go 60, 80, 100, 120, 180, 220, and I think 320, but we might be doing the 320 in the wet sanding. But we're basically going to dry sand them. We're not messing with the threads at all, just the center section there between the 2 different threads. And these are offered a lot of times on eBay, but a lot of times you're going to have to buy them with the hub if you're missing one of these or yours are in really bad condition. There's a gentleman on Garage Journal forum named, or his screen name is Old Iron Worker, and he makes and sells these for, there's 2 different size threads for the various Craftsman 100s and 150s. So you need to know what size thread you need, and he sells a set of all 3 of these for, I think they're like 70, 80 bucks. But then I've bought at least 2 sets from him in the past, and they are phenomenal. So after we wet sanded this, we went ahead and applied the Mother's Mag and aluminum polish, and here we're just buffing it off with the ShamWow. And that'll give that metal a nice shine. So we dry sanded and then we wet sanded, and I've got the other 2 that you'll see all of that happening on, but there's one unfinished and then there's one polished. So if you don't have a metal lathe, another option for you would be to just chuck these up in a drill and put that drill in a vise and do the same thing that I'm doing here, except with a drill and a vise. Just make sure you don't damage the threads and you should be good to hook. So it was dry sanding all the way up to 220. And then we wet sand 320, 400, 600, 800, and 1000 grit. And we are rinsing between each grit. If you don't rinse when you're wet sanding between each grit, then you're just fighting yourself. And then after we did the 1000 grit, we dried it off, and that's when we apply the Mother's Mag and aluminum polish and then buff that off. And this is pretty much the same process we're going to be doing for everything that we're going to be working on today in the metal lathe. But some parts we're concerned about the outside diameter on, so some of them we won't be dry sanding. We're just going to be wet sanding. And some of those we may not even be using 320. We may start at 400 or even 600. So like I said, we've got 3 of these that we needed to do. But you can easily see that, that work pays off. They look great. They look brand new once we're done with them for the most part. And it's one of the few things that we can clean up and make look, that good. In any case, took us 5 minutes or so to watch me work on all 3 of these. Took me about an hour and a half to do all that. And that Mother's Mag and aluminum polish, that stuff is just straight up magic. Highly recommend it. All right. So the next part we're going to be working on is the rotor. And this is one of those parts that we're not going to take a whole lot off because the diameter of the rotor where the bearings sit is important and needs to remain the same diameter. So all we're doing is going to be cleaning this up. And if you decide to do this, just keep in mind that those fan blades on the left-hand side and the mounting bracket on the right-hand side will definitely take a finger if you get it caught in that. So exercise extreme caution when you're working on this if you decide to do this. Now, this is not necessary. This is just something that I do that I want to make the rotor look better. And you're not even going to see it, so, no big deal. But, yeah, it's what I do. So I wet sand. We're going to do both ends of the rotor, and we're doing this 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit. We are not going to apply the mother's mag and aluminum polish to it. So we'll just flip it over and do the other side. Same thing. And now's the time, if that flat is really chewed up on the end, or there's some lines ground into that shaft from a slipping pulley or the set screw in the pulley, now's the time to clean that up. You can do that with a file. This one's in really good condition, so we didn't have to do that. And we're done. We can remove the rotor. Now, all these parts that we're taking down to bare metal or are polishing, we're going to be coating them with a penetrating oil later on in the video. Because obviously that bare metal is going to be susceptible to rusting. All right, so here we have the spindle pulley assembly. And we are going, this is made out of Zamek, by the way. We're going to dry sand it, wet sand it, and polish it. So again, we're starting at 60, doing 60, 80, 100, 120, 180, and 220. So these were not polished when they came from the factory or anything like that. They didn't have a shine to them. They just looked kind of a dull metal look. A lot of people think they're made out of aluminum, but they're made out of Zamek. But I like polishing them. I like the way they look when they're polished. And since you've got an open top to this drill press, the inner workings and all that kind of stuff kind of add to that vintage and Art Deco look. So I think they look great polished. And it's not going to affect their operation whether they're polished or not. So, this is strictly an aesthetic thing that I do. And there are some casting lines that are on these that you're not going to be able to sand out. You won't be able to get them to look perfect, but you can get them to look really good. So we're wet sanding at this point, and the wet sanding again is 320, 400, 600, 800, and 1,000, and we are rinsing between each grit. And then once we're done with the wet sanding, we will rinse and dry the pulley off, and then we will apply that mother's mag and aluminum polish. We're going to be doing this with the motor pulley as well. So obviously the spindle pulley assembly has a shaft on it, so that's easy to chuck into a lathe or whatever. The motor pulley does not have a shaft, so I basically cut my own piece of bar stock and use that as a shaft to be able to chuck it in the lathe and clean it up. But you can already see it's got that Cylon chrome glow to it. And looks much better. Now the Zamek won't really rust, but it will get a patina on it. And it'll eventually revert back to kind of what we saw when we first started, if you don't treat it with a penetrating oil or something like that. But I like the way they look when they're polished, so that's why I do it. We're not going to do anything with the shaft on it. So this is the motor pulley, and we're basically going to do the exact same thing. Keep in mind that the motor pulley will sit inverted, so it'll be upside down with the smallest sheave facing down instead of up like the spindle pulley assembly is oriented. So you're still going to see like the underside that's facing towards the chuck right now. You're still going to see that, and it would be really hard to polish that. I mean, I can reverse the pulley in the chuck right now, but there's little blades on the inside from the casting that make it really difficult to polish all of that on the inside. So I normally don't. I'll just kind of polish that outer rim, and that's it. Here we are wet sanding. Again, it's 320, 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit, rinsing between each grit. And you don't have to do as many steps as I'm doing. Like, you can skip a couple grits, especially in the dry sanding. But the more grits of sandpaper that you use, the more likely you are to get a better finish at the end. You're removing finer and finer scratches as you progress. And then we rinse and dry it off. Apply the mother's mag and aluminum polish to it, and then buff it off. And once this is done, you're going to need to come back and clean out the small holes that the set screws ride in and stuff with a Q-tip or something, because you're going to have polish down in there. But yeah, I think they turn out great when you polish them. And that Mother's Mag and aluminum polish, you can order it off of Amazon, but you can get it at just about all of your auto parts stores. And I don't remember who turned me on to it, but somebody turned me on to it back on the Garage Journal forum, and I've never looked back ever since I started playing with it. That stuff is just phenomenal. And it's not expensive. So I'm seeing a little bit of a wobble here, and now's the time, if you're going to attempt to straighten any of those sheaves, to do that as well. I'm not going to mess with these. These are fairly straight, so no big deal. But Sometimes you get a bend in one of them from where it got smacked with something, and you can just sort of tap that bend out with a brass punch and a brass tip hammer. So that's the motor pulley. And you could see that underside. So here we are. Some of these parts we polished in a previous video, and some of these, one or two of them I don't think got captured on video, like the pinion right there. But all of them got polished, as you've seen in part 7 and part 8. And here we are just applying the super slick stuff to them. And I'll apply this, and then I'll come back and wipe them down with a paper towel. And that's a good enough coating to, I've not had anything rust since and I do every one of my drill presses this same way. So, no problems whatsoever. Looks like there's still some pitting on those lock nuts and sleeves, but oh well. All right, so here we have the feed handle knobs, and I've got an old feed handle rod chucked into the lathe that I don't use for anything but this. And all we're going to do is wet sand these knobs. And so we're starting at 400, and we're doing 400, we're starting at 320, and we're going to go 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. Now, if you have a nick or something like that on one of these, you might want to dry sand it and kind of even it out before you start the wet sanding process. But these are in pretty good shape. And I'm working with a new microphone, so it seems to pick up everything, so you can probably hear my dog running upstairs from time to time. And the wife making dinner. But I go ahead and wet sand all 3 of the knobs, and then I come back and polish them. And it's the same process for each one of them. Remember to rinse between each grit. This is another one of those things you could do, chucking a rod into a drill if you don't have a metal lathe. All right, so for polishing these, we're going to use Meguiar's plastic cleaner wax. I think that's the title of it. And on a lot of my previous videos, I always said that you apply it and let it sit for like 10 to 15 minutes before you buff it. But somebody who has been through one of Meguiar's classes messaged me on YouTube in the comments of one of the videos and told me that you don't have to wait. You can just apply this stuff and start buffing right away. And it has a whatever compound it's made out of, it doesn't deteriorate. The grit of it gets finer and finer as you buff. So there's no reason to wait. So we're just applying it and then buffing it off with a microfiber rag. And that's how we do all 3 of those. So here we're going to clean up some panels, and again we're using that Meguiar's cleaner wax. And this stuff is safe to use on these panels. It will not damage the graphics or anything like that. So we just apply it and then buff it off. This is the data panel for the motor. And it's in really good condition. But if you have to have any of this stuff reproduced, there's a gentleman over on Garage Journal Forum. His username is Matt Blast, and he can reproduce any of these. I've had him do motor tags. He is reproducing, as we speak, the model number panel for me for this drill press. His prices are very fair, and the quality of the work is exceptional. But this motor panel tag turned out really well, so we don't need to reproduce it. Then we've got, this is the reset panel that's on the motor for the overload protection, the klaxon. And that little one up there is the on-off switch for the motor. And we're just going to clean them up real quick. And this stuff does a great job of removing grime and oil and debris. Sometimes it'll even remove some dried up paint that's on these. What it won't remove is rust. And you do not want to soak any of these in the simple green, because it will tear those graphics right off of them. You'll end up with a blank piece of aluminum or a blank piece of steel. And that on-off one is probably the one that's in the worst condition, but it's good enough. You can also find some of these for sale on eBay, and my good friend Frank Lee over on the Garage Journal Forum in the classified section always has Craftsman parts for sale. So he may have a panel or whatever that you need. So this is the headband panel for the 150, and it's got some pitting on it and some rust, but we're going to roll with it. So all we're going to do is polish it up with this wax cleaner polish stuff. And apparently Matt Blast has reproduced at least one of these for one of the people on Garage Journal, and it turned out phenomenal. I was blown away by it. I mean, it looked brand new, straight out of the factory. And that's no small ask for something like that. But yeah, and I don't know what he would charge for a headband, but if you were missing one, or if yours was completely toast, that's the route that I would go. And it gives back to the community. So like I said, there is some pitting there, and we're not going to be able to correct that. So we're just going to clean this up as best as possible. And somebody may appreciate that patina anyways. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. In the next video, I think we're going to start painting, maybe working on the motor as well. But yeah, it's coming along. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I appreciate all the support. As always, I will see you next time.